Checkpoint 3. Operations with rational numbers. Use the same processes with rational numbers, positive and negative fractions, as are done with integers, positive and negative whole numbers. So what you need to remember with fractions is that when you're adding and subtracting, you need to have the same denominator. So for example number 1, compute 1/3 plus -9/20. Now, 3 and 20 are obviously not the same numbers. So we need to come up with the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator for 3 and 20 is going to be the smallest number that we can multiply each of these by in order to create a common number. For 3 and 20, that number is going to be 60. So what we need to do in order to have the denominator be 60 is I need to multiply the numerator and the denominator by 20 for the first one and 3 for the second one. Remember, whatever I do to the denominator, I need to do to the numerator. Otherwise, I've changed the number. So I have 1/3 times 20 over 20 plus -9/20 times 3 over 3. 1 times 20 gives you 20. 3 times 20 gives you 60. 9 times 3 is 27, and 20 times 3 is 60. So now I have the same denominator. And again, when you're adding fractions, your denominator stays the same. So now my denominator is still 60. 20 plus -27 will give me -7. So that's how we get -7/60. For example number 2, I have two mixed numbers, -1 1/4 minus -3 9/10. Remember, when you subtract a negative, it becomes positive. So the first thing they did is they turned -1 1/4 minus -3 9/10 into -1 1/4 plus 3 9/10. You again need the same denominator. And for this one, they didn't turn it into a mixed number, but you will see some later examples where they do. But for this one, they left the -1 and the 3 by themselves. The common denominator for 4 and 10 would be 20. So we're going to multiply this one by 5 over 5 and this one by 2 over 2. 5 times 1 gives me 5. 4 times 5 gives me 20. Two times 9 gives me 18, and 10 times 2 gives me 20. -1 plus 3 is 2. -5, because remember the negative goes with both of these. So I have -5 plus 18 is 13, and again my denominator stays the same. For example number 3, I have -1 1/4 divided by 7 1/2. The first thing you need to do is turn these mixed numbers, which are numbers that have both fractions and whole numbers, into improper fractions, where everything is just written as a fraction. And the way you do that is first you multiply the whole number and the denominator. So I have 1 times 4, and then you add the numerator, plus 1. So -1 times 4 is 4, plus 1 gives me 5. Your denominator will stay the same. And of course, we don't want to forget the negative. For 7 1/2, I take 7 and multiply it by 2, and then I add 1, which gives me 15. 7 times 2 is 14, plus 1 is 15. My denominator stays the same, so I have 2 and 2. When you're dividing by a fraction, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, and that's something you've learned in previous courses. So when I have -5/4 divided by 15/2, that's the same as -5/4 times, since I'm going from division to multiplication, and the reciprocal of 15/2 is going to be 2/15. So then they like to multiply it as prime factors. So we have 5 times 2 in the numerator, 4 is the same as 2 times 2, 15 is the same as 3 times 5. And the reason we do that is it makes it a lot easier to simplify. You could absolutely write this as negative 10 over 10 over 60, and then simplify from there. However, we find it's a little easier if you write everything as a prime factor. You can cancel anything that's in both the numerator and the denominator. So I have a 5 here, and I have 2's here. A common mistake students will make is that they'll think since everything was canceled out of the numerator, it's now 0. Don't make that mistake. Your numerator is now 1. You multiply whatever is left in the denominator, so 2 times 3 will give you 6. Since we had a negative and a positive, my answer is negative, so I have negative 1/6. Let's look at a few more. For negative 2/3 plus negative 1/8, first we need to have the common denominator. For 3 and 8, my lowest common denominator will be 24. So I multiply 3 by 8, or I multiply negative 2/3 by 8 over 8, so I can get 24. And I multiply negative 1/8 by 3 over 3. 2 times 8 is 16. 3 times 8 is 24. 1 times 3 is 3. 8 times 3 is 24. And they're both still negative. Negative 16 plus negative 3 is negative 19. And again, your denominator will stay the same. For part B, I have 3/2 minus negative 1 1/3. So what we did is we separate first, subtracting a negative is the same as adding. So we switched my minus negative 1 1/3 into plus 1/3. 1 1/3. So the next thing they did is they made up common denominators for the two fractions. So we have 3 plus 1/2 and 1/3 is going to be, so 2 and 3, your lowest common denominator will be 6. So 1/2 times 3 over 3 is going to give me 6. And 1/3 times 2 over 2 will give me 2/6. So I have 3 plus 1, which gives me 4 for my whole number. 3 plus 2 gives me 5 for my numerator. And again, your denominator will stay the same. So your final answer is 4 and 5/6. For part C, we're multiplying. So I have negative 4 and 1/5 times negative 1 and 1/3. When you're multiplying fractions, you need to have two improper fractions. So what you need to do is first you need to convert negative 4 and 1/5 into an improper fraction. And again, an improper fraction is where the numerator is greater than the denominator, and there's no whole number in front. And the way we do this is you take your whole number, you multiply it by the denominator, and then you add the numerator. So I have 4 times 5, which is 20, plus 1, which gives me 21. Your denominator will stay the same. So I have negative 21/5 times negative 1/3. A negative times a negative is a positive, so those cancel each other out. 21 is made up of 7 times 3, and then we have a 1. And then 5 times 3 are just my denominators. I have a 3 in both the numerator and the denominator, so I can cancel those. So 7 times 1 will give me 7, and 5 times 1, since that's all that's left, is 5. However, we want to turn this back into a mixed number. So what we need to do is first you see how many times your denominator can go into your numerator. So 5 can only go into 7 once. So that's where my 1 comes from. I then subtract however many of 5s I took out. So in this instance, I took 1 set of 5. So I'm going to do 7 minus 5, which gives me my 2. And my denominator will stay the same. So that's where I get the answer 1 2/5. For part D, I have negative 2/3 divided by 1/4. So again, when you're dividing by a fraction, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So now it becomes negative 2/3 times, since my division is becoming multiplication, and the reciprocal of 1/4 is 4 over 1. We have negative 2 times 4 over 3 times 1. 2 times 4 is 8. 3 times 1 is 3. So now we have to convert this back into a mixed number. This time, 3 can go into 8 twice, because you have 3 and then you have 6. So 3 goes into 8 twice, which is where my 2 comes from. It's negative because I have a negative and a positive, so we have a negative 2. 8 minus 6, because that's how many I took away, leaves me with a 2, and my denominator stays the same. One way to check and see if you did this correctly is if your numerator is still greater than your denominator, you still can take more out. Your numerator should always be smaller than your denominator, so that's a good way to check and see if what you're doing is right. For part E, we have 1 3/4 plus negative 5 1/3. So now for this one, since we have positives and negatives, we have to convert both of them into improper fractions. 1 times 4 is 4, plus 3 gives us 7, and 4 stays the same. 5 times 3 is 15, plus 1 gives us 16, and the denominator stays the same. However, we do need to have the same denominator for both of them, so for 4 and 3, my common denominator is going to be 12. So I need to multiply this first one by 3 over 3, and my second one by 4 over 4. So 7/4 times 3 over 3. 7 times 3 is 21. 4 times 3 is 12. And then for the second one, I need to multiply by 4 over 4. 16 times 4 is 64. 3 times 4 is 12. 21 plus negative 64. The negative always goes with the numerator. So 21 plus negative 64 gives me 43, and the denominator stays the same as 12. Now I need to turn this improper fraction back into a mixed number. So in this case, 12 goes into 43 3 times. 36 would be the number. So I have negative 3, since my numbers were all negative. So I have negative 3. 43 minus 36 will give me 7, and my denominator stays at 12. For part F, I have negative 2 2/3 divided by negative 1 1/6. So again, I need to convert my mixed numbers into improper fractions. 2 times 3 is 6, plus 2 is 8, and my denominator stays 3. 1 times 6 is 6, plus 1 is 7, and my denominator stays 6. When you're dividing by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. So it becomes negative 8/3 times negative 6/7, because 7/6 becomes 6/7. 6 is the same as 3 times 2, and then I have a 3 and a 7, so I can cancel the 3's out. 8 times 2 is 16, and I have a 7 left in the denominator. Again, I need to convert this into a mixed number. 7 goes into 16 twice. You get the number 14, so that's where the 2 comes from. 16 minus 14 will give me my 2 in the numerator, and my denominator stays the same. One thing I want to note before we go over 2 of the problems that you were assigned to work on over the summer, you could absolutely sit there and just type all of this into your calculator, but please note that when we are taking a quiz on this at the end of the first week of school, you will be expected to show all of the work, and you'll be expected to have the work similar to what I have on my paper, and if you don't show all your work, you will not receive full credit. So that's something important to keep in mind. So we're going to look at number 1. We have 1/2 minus negative 5/12. So hopefully you realized you don't have the same denominator. So with 2 and 12, your common denominator will be 12. So we don't have to do anything to my second fraction. The only one I'm going to have to work on is my first one. So I'm going to multiply it by 6 over 6, since 6 times 2 will give me 12. And 6 times 1 is 6. So 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, so I have 6/12 minus negative 5/12. Hopefully you remember that when you subtract a negative, it becomes positive. So 6 minus negative 5 becomes 11, and my denominator stays the same. We're going to jump down to number 9, where you have negative 1 1/5 divided by negative 1/10. So the first thing we need to do is convert my mixed number into an improper fraction. 1 times 5 is 5, plus 1 is 6. So I have negative 6/5 divided by negative 1/10. So the next thing I need to do is that my division is going to turn into multiplication, and then I'm going to use the reciprocal. So I have negative 6/5 stays the same, my division becomes multiplication, and negative 1/10 becomes negative 10 over 1. So now I'm going to write these as prime factors. So 6 is 2 and 3. They're both negatives, which means that I'm going to have a positive answer. And 10 is 2 and 5. 5 is a prime number and 1 is a prime number. Now in this instance, I highlighted the numbers that are in common, but you'll see it more traditionally crossed out, but I just wanted to make sure you could see them. So I have a 5 in the numerator and a 5 in the denominator. So those are going to cancel each other out. So I'm left with 2 times 3 times 2, which is 12, and 1. And 12 divided by 1 is just 12. Hopefully you found that helpful, and you'll be able to go back and do numbers 2 through 8 and number 10 on your own. Again, if you have any further questions, you are more than welcome to email me at mbrenner@d131.org with your questions.